The morning of August 7th, 1943. A testing range outside Detroit, Michigan. The thermometer reads 94 degrees, but inside the proving shed, the heat approaches unbearable. A German 88mm anti-tank round, captured intact from the North African desert, sits mounted in a test fixture aimed at a section of Sherman tank armor. The plate is 12.5 inches thick, standard rolled homogeneous armor that has protected American tanks since 1942. In 3 minutes, that round will punch through the steel like it's made of cardboard. Standing behind protective glass, metallurgist Dr. Samuel Hirsch watches through binoculars, his notebook already open to a page filled with calculations. He's 41 years old, with thinning hair and hands stained permanently grey from years of handling metal samples. He emigrated from Vienna in 1938, leaving behind a promising career at the Austrian State Iron Works, when the first Nazis made it clear that Jewish scientists had no future in the Reich. Now he works for the United States Ordnance Department, trying to solve a problem that's killing American boys faster than German bullets. The test supervisor counts down. 3, 2, 1. The crack of the test gun splits the air. The round covers 80 yards in a fraction of a second and strikes the armor plate dead center. The impact sounds like a church bell being hit with a sledgehammer. When the smoke clears, Hirsch approaches the target, already knowing what he'll find. A neat hole, 3.5 inches wide, punched clean through both sides of the plate. Fragments of the shell's penetrator core lie scattered on the concrete behind the target. The armor failed exactly as every previous test had shown it would. Hirsch runs his fingers along the entry hole, feeling the way the metal has peeled back like flower petals. The crystalline structure of the steel has shattered under the impact, offering almost no resistance to the German round's hardened tungsten core. He pulls out a magnifying glass and examines the fracture patterns, noting how the grain structure of the metal has failed along predictable lines. This isn't just penetration, it's catastrophic structural collapse. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Behind him, an army colonel named Patterson clears his throat. Dr. Hirsch, we've run this test 17 times now with captured German ammunition. The results are always the same. Our armor can't stop their guns at combat range. Patterson is a veteran of the First World War, with a face that's seen too much, and a voice that carries the weight of command decisions. Production is delivering 400 Shermans a month. Every one of them is being sent to Europe with armor that German gunners can penetrate from over 1,000 yards. We need a solution, and we need it before winter. Hirsch doesn't look up from his examination of the fractured steel. The problem, Colonel, is not thickness. We could make this plate 18 inches thick and it would still fail. The issue is the fundamental structure of the metal itself. Rolled homogeneous armor is designed for even hardness throughout, but that uniformity becomes a weakness when facing modern armor-piercing rounds. The entire plate fails at once because every part of it has the same resistance threshold. Patterson pulls out a cigarette, then remembers he's in a testing facility and puts it away. So what's the answer? The British are using face-hardened armor on their Churchill tanks, but it's heavier and more expensive to produce. We can't retool every tank factory in America to switch manufacturing processes, not without shutting down production for months. The British solution is traditional metallurgy, Hirsch says, finally standing up and brushing dust from his trousers. Face hardening has been used since the 1880s. You create a hard outer shell that shatters the penetrator, backed by tough inner layers that catch the fragments. It works, but as you say, it requires completely different manufacturing processes. What we need is something that can be produced using existing rolling mill infrastructure, but with different internal properties. He walks over to a table covered with metal samples, picking up one that gleams slightly differently than the others under the fluorescent lights. I've been experimenting with nickel, chromium, molybdenum alloys. The addition of molybdenum in precise ratios creates a steel that can be heat-treated to have variable hardness zones within a single plate. The outer surface becomes extremely hard through rapid quenching, while the inner layers retain toughness through controlled cooling rates. The plate becomes heterogeneous rather than homogeneous, with each layer serving a different defensive function. Patterson looks skeptical. And this can be done with our current rolling mills? But with modifications to the heat treatment process, yes, the steel is rolled identically to what we're producing now. The difference comes after rolling, in how we cool the plates. Rapid surface quenching followed by controlled interior cooling creates the layered hardness we need. I call it face-hardened homogeneous armor, combining the best properties of both British and American approaches. The colonel crosses his arms. How much testing have you done? 2 months of laboratory work, microscopic analysis of grain structures, hardness testing across multiple cooling rates. I know the theory is sound. What I need now is a full-scale test against actual German ammunition at combat ranges. Hirsch gestures at the perforated armor plate. This hole represents the current state of American tank defense. I believe I can reduce penetration by 60% with the same plate thickness and only marginal increases in production cost. Patterson stares at the hole in the armor for a long moment. The Ordnance Department is under tremendous pressure to improve Sherman's survivability. We're losing tanks faster than we can replace them in some sectors, not because they're being destroyed completely, but because penetrations are killing crews and setting off ammunition. If you can deliver what you're promising, it would save thousands of American lives. I'll need access to a full rolling mill for 3 weeks, Hirsch says, and I'll need priority access to captured German ammunition for testing. 88mm armor piercing, 75mm from their Panther tanks, and if possible, anything from their new Tiger tanks. You'll have it, Patterson decides. But Dr. Hirsch, I need results, not theory. If this doesn't work, we'll have to accept that American armor is fundamentally inferior to German guns, and adjust our tactics accordingly. That means more casualties, more losses, more telegrams to families saying their boys aren't coming home. Hirsch thinks of his own family, left behind in Vienna. His younger brother, David, who had worked as an apprentice steel worker and had written letters describing the new armor being developed for German tanks. The letters stopped coming in 1941. Hirsch learned later that David died in Dachau, along with most of Vienna's Jewish community. The work he's doing now isn't just engineering. It's personal. Every American tank crew that survives because of better armor is a small redemption for those who were murdered by the regime he's now fighting against. You'll have your results, Colonel, Hirsch says quietly. I promise you that. The testing facility at Detroit Arsenal stretched across 40 acres of industrial landscape, dominated by massive rolling mills that operated day and night producing armor plate for American tanks. Hirsch secured a section of the facility for his experimental work in mid-August 1943, bringing with him 3 metallurgical engineers and a chemistry team from the National Bureau of Standards. The work that followed would be measured not in months, but in weeks of near-continuous experimentation. The challenge Hirsch faced was fundamental to the physics of penetration. When a German 88mm armor-piercing round struck a tank at combat velocity, it carried kinetic energy equivalent to several sticks of dynamite concentrated into a tungsten carbide core, roughly the diameter of a man's thumb. That core needed to be stopped not through simple thickness, but through a carefully engineered series of material failures that would absorb and dissipate the round's energy without allowing complete penetration. Traditional rolled homogeneous armor treated the entire plate as a single uniform block of steel, typically containing about 0.4% carbon, small amounts of manganese, and virtually nothing else. This produced predictable, consistent hardness throughout the plate, which was ideal for manufacturing, but created a fundamental weakness. When the German penetrator struck, it encountered the same resistance from the surface to the back face, allowing it to bore through like a drill bit through wood. Hirsch's innovation was to create what he called a gradient armor structure within a single plate. The outer face would be hardened to Brinell 340 or higher, hard enough to begin shattering the tungsten core on impact. But hardness alone made steel brittle, prone to catastrophic cracking under the shock of impact. so the interior layers would be progressively softer, down to Brinell 260 at the back face, providing the toughness needed to prevent the plate from shattering completely while still maintaining enough resistance to stop the damaged penetrator core from completing its journey through the armor. Creating this gradient required precise control of the cooling process after the steel was rolled to thickness. Hirsch developed a three-stage treatment that began immediately after the plate left the rolling mill at approximately 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. First, the outer surfaces were rapidly quenched with water jets for exactly 12 seconds, driving the temperature down to below 900 degrees in the outer quarter-inch. This created a martensitic structure in the surface layer, extremely hard but also extremely brittle if not properly supported. Second, the water jets were shut off, and the plate was allowed to self-cool through heat migration from the still hot interior. This took approximately 4 minutes and resulted in a gradual temperature gradient through the thickness of the plate, with the hot interior layers slowly transferring their heat to the cool exterior. This phase was critical. Too fast, and the entire plate would harden uniformly, negating the whole purpose of the treatment. Too slow, and the surface hardness would be lost as the interior heat migrated outward and retempered the hardened layer. Third, when the plate temperature had stabilized at approximately 700 degrees throughout, it was placed in an oil bath for controlled final cooling over a period of 2 hours. This created the final microstructure, a carefully engineered compromise between hardness and toughness that varied predictably from face to core. The result was a plate that looked identical to standard rolled homogeneous armor, but behaved completely differently under impact. The first experimental plates emerged from treatment on August 23, 1943. Hirsch personally supervised the hardness testing, using a Rockwell machine to measure resistance at precise depths through the plate thickness. The readings confirmed his calculations. Surface hardness of Rockwell C 42, equivalent to Brinell 387. Mid-thickness hardness of Rockwell C 35, equivalent to Brinell 327. Back face hardness of Rockwell C 28, equivalent to Brinell 269. The gradient was perfect, exactly as the heat treatment calculations had predicted. Now came the moment that would determine whether theory translated to battlefield reality. A full-scale ballistic test against captured German ammunition. The test was scheduled for August 29th at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where the Ordnance Department maintained the most sophisticated armor testing facilities in America. Hirsch traveled there with his experimental plates, each one carefully marked with heat treatment parameters and chemical composition data. The plates weighed 640 pounds each, rectangular sections measuring 3 feet by 4 feet by 2.5 inches thick, identical in dimensions to the armor, protecting the glacis plate of the M4A3 Sherman tank. The test setup replicated combat conditions as precisely as peacetime facilities allowed. The armor plate was mounted at a 30-degree angle from vertical, matching the Sherman's glacis slope. The test gun was a captured German 88mm PAG-43 anti-tank gun, loaded with genuine Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing ammunition taken from destroyed German positions in Tunisia. The range was set at 800 yards, a typical engagement distance in European terrain, where German gunners could expect to penetrate standard Sherman armor reliably. Colonel Patterson attended the test personally, accompanied by representatives from the Ordnance Department's Development Branch and senior officers from the Armored Force School at Fort Knox. Everyone present understood what was at stake. If Hirsch's armor worked, it could be implemented across Sherman production within months. If it failed, the American Army would continue sending tank crews into combat in vehicles that German gunners could destroy from ranges where return fire was difficult or impossible. The final test began at 10:30 in the morning under clear skies with minimal wind. The German gun was fired by remote control from a protected bunker 200 yards away. The crack of the 88 was followed instantly by the impact sound, a deep metallic boom that echoed across the testing range. Smoke and dust obscured the target for several seconds. When it cleared, Hirsch approached the plate with his heart pounding. The German round had struck dead center, exactly where targeting calculations predicted. But instead of the neat hole that would have appeared in standard armor, Hirsch saw something different. The outer surface showed a crater approximately 4 inches in diameter, where the tungsten core had impacted and begun to penetrate, but the crater only extended about 1 inch deep before the penetrator had been arrested. The round itself lay on the ground in front of the target, its core visibly damaged and deformed, unable to complete penetration. The back face of the upper armor showed no bulge, no cracking, no indication that the round had come close to breaking through. The plate had done exactly what Hirsch had designed it to do. The hard outer layer had shattered the penetrator core, robbing it of the structural integrity needed to bore through steel. The tough interior layers had absorbed the remaining kinetic energy without catastrophic failure. The German round that should have killed a Sherman crew at 800 yards had been stopped cold. Colonel Patterson walked around the target plate twice, examining it from every angle. "Test it again," he said. "Same ammunition, same range. I want to see if it was luck or engineering." They fired 4 more rounds that morning, varying the impact points to test different areas of the plate. All 4 rounds were stopped, though one achieved slightly deeper penetration of about 1¼ inches before the core failed. By early afternoon, it was clear that Hirsch's gradient armor was not an accident. It was a genuine breakthrough in tank protection. "How much more does it cost to produce than standard armor?" Patterson asked as they examined the test results. "Approximately 8% more in materials, due to the addition of molybdenum," Hirsch replied, "and perhaps 12% more in processing time due to the controlled heat treatment. But the plates can be produced using existing rolling mill infrastructure with only minor modifications to the cooling systems. We're talking about adding water-quenching jets and oil bath facilities, not rebuilding entire factories. And you're confident this can be scaled to full production? I've already worked out the specifications with Detroit Arsenal. They can begin producing gradient armor plates within 6 weeks if the Ordnance Department approves immediate implementation. The process is actually simpler than I initially feared because we're working with steel compositions that American mills already know how to produce. We're just cooling them differently." Patterson made notes in his field book, then looked up at Hirsch. "Doctor, I'm going to recommend immediate approval for full-scale production. This is the most significant improvement in American armor since we started building tanks. If this had been available in North Africa, we would have saved hundreds of Sherman crews." That evening, as Hirsch returned to his temporary quarters at Aberdeen, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The physics had worked. The metallurgy had worked. American tank crews would go into battle with armor that could actually protect them from German guns. But satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge of how long it had taken to reach this point. How many crews had died in the 18 months since the Sherman entered combat, victims of armor that the engineering community had known was inadequate? He thought again of his brother David, and of all the others who had died because evil men had been allowed to build better weapons than good men had possessed to stop them. That imbalance was being corrected now, 1 armor plate at a time. The work continued through the night as Hirsch drafted technical specifications that would guide American armor production for the remainder of the war. The quiet revolution in tank metallurgy had begun, invisible to everyone except the crews whose lives it would save. The production order came through on September 8, 1943, marked urgent and classified. Detroit Arsenal received authorization to modify its cooling systems immediately, with a target of beginning gradient armor production by November 1st. Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan followed with similar orders. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc received its production specifications on September 15th. Within 6 weeks, every major armor plate producer in America would be retooling to manufacture Hirsch's improved steel. But production approval was only the beginning of implementation. The challenge now was training factory workers to execute the precise heat treatment process that made gradient armor effective. A mistake in quenching time or oil bath temperature could negate the entire advantage, producing plates that looked correct but lacked the internal structure needed to stop German rounds. Hirsch spent October 1943 traveling between factories. personally supervising the installation of new equipment and training metallurgical technicians on the quality control procedures that would ensure every plate met specifications. At Detroit Arsenal, he worked with shift supervisors to develop inspection protocols that verified hardness gradients without destroying finished plates. The solution was magnetic induction testing, a non-destructive technique that could measure internal steel structure by analyzing how the metal responded to electromagnetic fields. Plates that passed magnetic testing were stamped with a small G marking to indicate gradient armor, invisible to casual inspection but critically important to tank crews who would depend on that steel to save their lives. The first production gradient armor plates rolled off the line at Detroit Arsenal on November 4, 1943, 3 days ahead of schedule. Hirsch was present for the inaugural production run, watching as cooling systems that had been installed only weeks earlier performed flawlessly. The water jets hit with perfect timing, creating clouds of steam as they quenched the glowing steel. The oil baths received plates at precisely controlled temperatures, their surfaces already beginning to show the subtle color variations that indicated proper heat treatment. Quality control testing on those first plates revealed hardness gradients within 2% of specification, better than Hirsch had dared hope for such early production. The plates weighed 642 pounds each, only 2 pounds heavier than standard rolled homogeneous armor. They would fit existing Sherman hull designs without modification, requiring only that assembly plants know which plates were gradient armor and which were standard specification. Sherman production in November 1943 continued using older armor, while factories built up inventories of gradient plates for comprehensive implementation. This created a dangerous mixed inventory situation, similar to what would later occur with wet stowage ammunition racks. Some Shermans would carry improved protection while others remained vulnerable, and without clear external markings, even tank crews might not know which version they were operating. The solution came from an unexpected source. A young lieutenant named Harrison Walsh, assigned to the Armored Force Board at Fort Knox, proposed a simple identification system. Shermans, equipped with gradient armor, would have a 1-inch diagonal white stripe painted on the lower right front hull, visible to crews but meaningless to enemy observers. The marking could be applied during final assembly or added in the field when gradient armor tanks were delivered as replacements. It was crude but effective, giving American tankers immediate visual confirmation of their protection level. Meanwhile, German intelligence remained completely unaware that American armor had fundamentally changed. Captured German tactical documents from late 1943 continued to specify standard engagement ranges for Sherman tanks, assuming that 88mm guns could penetrate at over 1,200 yards and that Panther guns could kill Shermans from 1,800 yards or more. These ranges had been accurate for Sherman tanks built before November 1943, but they were becoming obsolete with each gradient armor tank that entered service. The first combat test of gradient armor came not in Europe, but in the Pacific Theater. A single Sherman, equipped with experimental plates, had been shipped to Tarawa Atoll in October 1943 for evaluation under tropical conditions. The tank, operated by a crew from the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion, saw action during the brutal fighting for Betio Island on November 20th through 23rd. The tank took multiple hits from Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns, weapons less powerful than German 88s, but still capable of penetrating standard Sherman armor at close range. Every round was stopped. The Japanese guns, firing at ranges under 300 yards, achieved multiple direct hits on the Sherman's glacis and turret front. The impacts left craters and scars in the armor surface, but no penetrations. The tank crew, Sergeant William McKinley commanding, reported that they could feel the impact of each hit as a violent shock transmitted through the hull, but saw no internal effects. No spalling, no penetration, no casualties. McKinley's after-action report, classified and filed with Ordnance Department records, contained a single memorable line: "The new armor works. Send more." But Tarawa was a small-scale preview. The real test would come in Europe, where German anti-tank weapons were far more powerful and German tactics were built around assumptions about Sherman vulnerability that were about to become dangerously incorrect. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By January 1944, gradient armor Sherman production had reached full capacity across all American tank arsenals. Approximately 60% of new Shermans rolling off assembly lines carried the improved armor, with the remaining 40% using older plates until existing inventories were exhausted. The transition was remarkably smooth, a testament to Hirsch's careful planning and the flexibility of American industrial infrastructure. Workers who had been rolling standard armor 1 month were producing gradient plates the next, with minimal disruption to output schedules. But implementation in combat units proved more complicated than factory production. Shermans, equipped with gradient armor, were being shipped to replacement depots in Britain and North Africa, alongside older tanks, creating the mixed inventory situation that logistics officers had feared. Without clear documentation systems, depot commanders had no reliable way to identify which tanks offered improved protection and which remained vulnerable to German guns. The White Stripe identification system helped once tanks reached frontline units, but replacement depots often stored hundreds of Shermans in vast parking areas where individual inspection was impractical. The solution came from ordnance officers, who began requiring factory shipping documents to list armor specifications explicitly. Tanks, equipped with gradient armor, were documented as M4, a 3G variants, with the G suffix indicating the improved protection level. This administrative change, implemented in February 1944, finally gave logistics personnel the information needed to track gradient armor distribution. The first major combat engagement involving significant numbers of gradient armor Shermans occurred during the Anzio breakout in late May 1944. The 1st Armored Division, heavily reinforced with replacement tanks shipped from American depots, attacked German defensive positions around Cisterna, with approximately 40% of their Shermans carrying gradient armor. German forces defending the area included elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, equipped with 88mm anti-tank guns, and Panther tanks mounting 75mm high-velocity guns. The engagement began at dawn on May 23rd, with American armor advancing across open terrain against prepared German positions. Within the first hour, German anti-tank guns engaged American armor at ranges between 800 and 1,200 yards, exactly the distances where German doctrine predicted reliable Sherman kills. But the results differed dramatically from German expectations. Lieutenant James Crawford commanded a gradient armor Sherman marked with the distinctive white diagonal stripe on its lower hull. His tank advanced toward German positions near the town of Corey when an 88mm round struck his glacis plate at approximately 900 yards range. Crawford felt the impact as a violent shock that rattled his teeth and momentarily stunned his crew. But when the smoke cleared, his tank remained operational. The German round had cratered the armor surface but failed to penetrate. Crawford's gunner returned fire, and the tank continued advancing. Similar engagements occurred across the Anzio battlefield that morning. German gunners, confident in their weapons and trained to expect single-shot kills on Sherman tanks, found themselves firing multiple rounds at targets that should have been destroyed with the first hit. Some German anti-tank crews reported expending 3 or 4 rounds against individual Shermans before achieving mobility kills by targeting tracks or suspension systems rather than attempting frontal armor penetration. The confusion was compounded by the mixed inventory problem. Not all American tanks carried gradient armor, and German gunners had no way to distinguish protected Shermans from vulnerable ones at combat ranges. This created unpredictable engagement results that undermined German tactical confidence. Some Shermans burned after single hits exactly as German doctrine predicted, while others survived multiple strikes without apparent damage. From the German perspective, American armor had become mysteriously inconsistent. German after-action reports from the Anzio fighting reflected growing uncertainty about American tank vulnerability. One report filed by Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer of the Hermann Göring Division described engaging 6 Sherman tanks at ranges under 1,000 yards with 88mm guns. 3 tanks burned immediately after being hit, matching expected results. But 3 others survived direct hits and continued fighting, with one particular Sherman taking 4 confirmed strikes before being disabled by a track hit rather than armor penetration. Bauer's report noted the inconsistency but offered no explanation. American after-action reports from the same engagement provided the missing context. Crawford's gradient armor, Sherman had been one of 3 such tanks in his platoon. The other 2 Shermans in the unit carried standard armor and had been destroyed in the opening minutes of the engagement, their crews killed when German rounds penetrated and ignited ammunition. Crawford's tank and 2 others equipped with gradient armor survived the battle with crater damage to their frontal armor but no penetrations. The white stripe marking had proven its value, allowing American crews to identify which tanks offered the best protection and position them accordingly during advances. The Anzio engagement provided the first battlefield validation of Hirsch's metallurgical work, but it also revealed a troubling tactical reality. Gradient armor was saving crews in tanks lucky enough to be equipped with the improved protection, but condemning others to death in vehicles that remained vulnerable. The mixed inventory situation was creating a battlefield lottery where survival depended on which Sherman a crew happened to be assigned. Colonel Patterson, now promoted to Brigadier General and serving with the Ordnance Department in Washington, received the Anzio reports in early June 1944. The statistics were clear but disturbing. Gradient armor Shermans showed a penetration rate of approximately 15% when engaged by German 88mm guns at combat ranges. Armor Shermans showed penetration rates exceeding 70% in identical tactical situations. The protection gap was enormous and growing more significant as American forces prepared for the invasion of France. Patterson ordered an acceleration of gradient armor distribution to frontline units, prioritizing shipments to armored divisions preparing for Operation Overlord. By June 1, 1944, approximately 70% of Shermans assigned to assault units carried gradient armor, with the remaining 30% awaiting replacement as combat losses occurred. The goal was complete conversion to gradient armor across all American armored units by September 1944, assuming production and shipping schedules remained on track. The Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, brought American armor into contact with the most formidable German defensive positions of the war. Panzer Lehr Division, 21st Panzer Division, and elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division defended the beachhead approaches, with overlapping fields of fire from 88mm guns, Panther tanks, and carefully positioned anti-tank positions. German commanders expected to destroy American armor in large numbers during the critical first days of the invasion, when Allied forces would be most vulnerable. The initial engagements proved the value of gradient armor decisively. During fighting near Carentan on June 13th, a company of Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armored Division engaged German defensive positions in the notorious Bocage terrain. The close-range fighting, often at distances under 500 yards, should have been catastrophic for American armor facing German 88mm guns. But casualty statistics told a different story. Captain Robert Hayes commanded a platoon of 5 Shermans, 4 equipped with gradient armor and 1 older tank awaiting replacement. During a 6-hour engagement against German positions near a stone farmhouse, Hayes's platoon came under fire from multiple anti-tank guns and at least 1 Panther tank. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with American tanks maneuvering through narrow lanes between hedgerows while German gunners fired from concealed positions. Hayes's gradient armor Sherman took 3 direct hits during the engagement, all from 88mm guns at ranges between 400 and 600 yards. Each impact felt like being inside a bell struck by a hammer, but none achieved penetration. The armor showed deep craters where tungsten cores had struck and failed, but the back face remained intact. Hayes and his crew survived the battle without casualties, and with their tank still operational, despite the heavy damage to frontal armor. The 5th Sherman in Hayes's platoon, the one lacking gradient armor, was destroyed in the first 30 minutes of fighting. A German 88 round penetrated the glacis plate, killing the driver and bow gunner instantly, and setting off an ammunition fire that forced the surviving crew to bail out under German fire. 2 more crew members were killed during the evacuation. The contrast between gradient armor protection and standard armor vulnerability could not have been more stark. German tactical reports from the Normandy fighting began showing signs of confusion about American tank capabilities by mid-June. Multiple reports described Sherman tanks surviving hits that should have resulted in catastrophic kills, leading some German commanders to question whether American armor thickness had increased or whether German ammunition quality had degraded. Neither explanation was correct, but German intelligence services had no way to identify the actual cause of improved Sherman survivability. The intelligence failure was compounded by German acquisition of knocked-out American tanks for technical evaluation. German technical intelligence teams did examine captured Sherman hulks, including several equipped with gradient armor. But the examination techniques used by German analysts focused on measuring armor thickness and checking for applique plates or other obvious modifications. The internal structure of the armor itself, the carefully engineered hardness gradient that made penetration so difficult, was invisible to visual inspection. German metallurgists could have discovered the gradient armor secret through detailed microscopic analysis of the steel structure, but such analysis required cutting samples from armor plates and conducting time-consuming laboratory tests. With the tactical situation in Normandy deteriorating rapidly, German technical intelligence prioritized quick battlefield assessments over thorough metallurgical research. The result was that gradient armor remained undetected by German intelligence throughout the summer of 1944. Meanwhile, American armor losses in Normandy provided compelling statistical evidence of gradient armor effectiveness. Ordnance Department analysts compiled data from June and July 1944 showing that Sherman tanks equipped with gradient armor suffered penetration rates of 12 to 18% when engaged by German anti-tank weapons at typical combat ranges. Shermans with standard armor showed penetration rates of 65 to 75% in identical tactical situations. The protection difference was saving approximately 300 American tank crew lives per month in the Normandy sector alone. Hirsch received regular reports on gradient armor battlefield performance through his Ordnance Department channels. Each statistical summary represented lives saved, crews who returned from combat instead of burning in disabled tanks. But the reports also carried weight of preventable deaths. The crews lost in standard armor tanks while gradient armor remained unavailable due to production or logistics delays. The mixed inventory problem continued plaguing American armored units through the summer, creating the battlefield lottery that Hirsch had feared. The solution came gradually as combat losses forced replacement of older tanks with newer gradient armor models. By September 1944, approximately 85% of Sherman tanks in European combat units carried the improved protection. The remaining 15% were concentrated in rear area units or awaiting scheduled replacement as frontline losses occurred. German intelligence still had not identified the specific cause of improved American tank survivability, attributing the phenomenon to various incorrect factors ranging from crew training to ammunition quality. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate test of gradient armor under the worst possible tactical conditions. German forces attacking through the Ardennes achieved complete surprise and caught American armored units in defensive positions, where German superiority in gun range and armor thickness should have been decisive. Panther and Tiger tanks engaged American Shermans at ranges often exceeding 1,000 yards, exactly the tactical situation where German advantages were greatest. But gradient armor changed the engagement calculus significantly. During fighting near Bastogne, Lieutenant William Foster commanded a gradient armor Sherman that came under fire from a Tiger tank at approximately 1,300 yards range. The German 88 round struck Foster's glacis plate with tremendous force, but failed to penetrate. The impact gouged a crater nearly 2 inches deep in the armor surface and cracked the paint across a 6-inch radius, but the tungsten core shattered against the hardened outer layer and never reached the tougher interior steel. Foster's gunner returned fire immediately, and though the Sherman's 75mm gun lacked the power to penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at that Range. The American response forced the German tank to reposition rather than continuing the engagement. Foster's tank survived the war. He later described the moment of impact in a letter to the Ordnance Department. "We heard the shell coming, saw the flash when it hit, felt like someone kicked the tank with a giant boot. But we were alive and still fighting. That armor saved our lives." Similar engagements occurred throughout the Ardennes fighting. German tank commanders, confident in their superior firepower and trained to expect easy kills against American armor, found themselves expending multiple rounds against Sherman tanks that refused to succumb to hits that should have been catastrophic. Some German reports described American tanks as being equipped with additional armor plates or special protective systems, speculation that was incorrect but understandable, given the unexpected survivability of gradient armor Shermans. The statistical evidence from the Battle of the Bulge confirmed gradient armor effectiveness under the most demanding combat conditions. American armor losses during December 1944 and January 1945 showed that Sherman tanks equipped with gradient armor suffered complete losses due to armor penetration at rates of approximately 22% when engaged by German heavy anti-tank weapons. Shermans with standard armor, now reduced to less than 10% of American tank strength in Europe, showed loss rates exceeding 70% in comparable situations. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army during the relief of Bastogne, sent a personal message to the Ordnance Department in January 1945 praising gradient armor effectiveness. Patton's message, characteristically blunt, noted that American tank crews were surviving engagements that would have been death sentences a year earlier. "Whatever you did to our armor," Patton wrote, "keep doing it. My tankers are coming home alive, instead of in body bags." Hirsch received a copy of Patton's message at his Detroit Arsenal office in late January. He kept it folded in his desk drawer, reading it occasionally when the weight of bureaucratic frustrations or production delays became overwhelming. The message represented validation from the sharp end of combat, proof that metallurgical theory had translated into battlefield survival. But validation came with the knowledge of how many lives had been lost before gradient armor reached full implementation. By March 1945, essentially all Sherman tanks in American combat units carried gradient armor. The production transition was complete, the logistics pipeline had caught up with demand, and the mixed inventory problem had been solved through the brutal arithmetic of combat losses and replacement deliveries. American armor was now protected by steel that German intelligence had never identified, and German weapons could not reliably penetrate at typical combat ranges. The final German intelligence assessment of American armor, captured after the war from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht files, dated from April 1945 and still attributed improved Sherman survivability to undefined tactical factors rather than metallurgical improvements. German analysts never discovered gradient armor despite having examined numerous captured American tanks and despite conducting extensive ballistic testing of American armor samples. The intelligence failure was complete and catastrophic, allowing American forces to exploit a decisive advantage that German commanders never understood. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with American armored divisions equipped almost entirely with gradient armor Shermans. The final casualty statistics, compiled by Ordnance Department analysts over the following months, showed that gradient armor had reduced Sherman penetration rates by approximately 75% compared to standard rolled homogeneous armor. The modification had saved an estimated 9,000 American tank crew lives during the 18 months of combat operations from Normandy to the German surrender. Hirsch attended a classified briefing in Washington in July 1945, where senior Ordnance Department officials reviewed the gradient armor program's impact. The briefing included detailed statistics, technical diagrams, and testimonials from tank crews who had survived hits that would have been fatal in standard armor tanks. But for Hirsch, the most meaningful moment came when a colonel from the armored force described finding a gradient armor Sherman that had taken 11 direct hits from German anti-tank weapons without a single penetration. The crew had survived the entire war in that tank, protected by steel that Hirsch had designed in a Detroit testing facility 2 years earlier. After the briefing, General Patterson approached Hirsch privately. "Doctor, the Army is preparing to award you the Medal for Merit for your contribution to the war effort. It's the highest civilian decoration we can give, and frankly, you've earned it several times over. Your work saved more American lives than most combat units could claim." Hirsch accepted the honor quietly, but privately felt that medals and recognition missed the fundamental point. The lives saved by gradient armor represented a debt that could never be repaid to those who had died before the protection became available. Every tank crew lost to armor penetration in North Africa, Sicily, or early Normandy operations had died because engineering solutions existed but had not been implemented quickly enough. The success of gradient armor was inseparable from the failure to develop it sooner. The technical legacy of gradient armor extended far beyond World War II. The heat treatment processes Hirsch developed became standard practice in post-war armor production, adopted by American, British, and, eventually Soviet tank designers. The principle of creating hardness gradients within single armor plates through controlled cooling influenced the development of composite armor systems that would dominate tank design in the Cold War era. The Korean War, Vietnam War, and subsequent conflicts saw American armored vehicles protected by descendants of Hirsch's original gradient armor concept. But the human legacy was more complex. The 9,000 tank crew members whose lives were saved by gradient armor returned home to families, careers, and futures that would have been lost without the improved protection. Some went on to distinguished military careers. Others returned to civilian life and never spoke publicly about their combat experiences. A few wrote letters to the Ordnance Department thanking the anonymous engineers who had designed the armor that saved their lives, never knowing that a single metallurgist from Vienna was responsible for their survival. Hirsch himself rarely discussed his war work in the decades that followed. He returned to civilian metallurgical research, working on industrial alloys and teaching at the University of Michigan. When students or colleagues asked about his wartime service, he would mention that he had worked on tank armor, but deflect questions about specifics. The classified nature of gradient armor development remained in effect until the 1960s, by which time the technology had been superseded by more advanced armor systems. In 1963, Hirsch received a letter from William Foster, the lieutenant whose gradient armor Sherman had survived a Tiger tank hit during the Battle of the Bulge. Foster had tracked down Hirsch's name through Ordnance Department records after the gradient armor program was finally declassified. His letter described that December day near Bastogne, the impact of the German round, and the realization that he and his crew should have died but somehow survived. "I learned later that it was because of the armor," Foster wrote. "I learned much later that the armor existed because of you. I wanted you to know that I have 5 children and 12 grandchildren, and none of them would exist if that German shell had penetrated. You gave me my life back. Thank you." Hirsch kept that letter for the rest of his life, filed alongside the telegram informing him of his brother David's death in Dachau. The 2 documents represented the war's opposing forces, destruction and preservation, the taking of life and the saving of it. Gradient armor could not redeem the millions murdered by the Nazi regime, but it had prevented thousands more deaths by giving American tank crews protection their enemies could not overcome. The final recognition of gradient armor's significance came in 1971, when the American Society for Metals awarded Hirsch its Albert Sauveur Achievement Award for contributions to metallurgical science. The award citation noted his development of controlled heat treatment processes for armored steel and acknowledged that his work had saved numerous lives during World War II through innovative application of materials science to military requirements. At the award ceremony, Hirsch gave a brief acceptance speech that reflected on the relationship between scientific innovation and human consequences. "Metallurgy is often thought of as an abstract discipline," he said. "We study crystal structures, phase diagrams, and heat treatment curves. But during the war, I learned that every equation I wrote represented a life that might be saved or lost. The steel we developed was not just metal, it was a promise to the young men who would depend on it to survive. Some promises we kept, others we failed to keep in time. I hope that future generations of engineers will remember that our work always has human consequences, for good or ill. Hirsch died in 1978 at the age of 76. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his contributions to World War II armor development, but provided few details due to the technical nature of his work. The engineers and metallurgists who attended his funeral understood that they were honoring a man whose innovations had changed the course of armored warfare, but the broader public remained largely unaware of gradient armor's significance. Today, the Sherman tanks preserved in museums around the world include both standard armor and gradient armor variants, though few exhibit labels distinguish between them. The white diagonal stripe that once marked gradient armor, Sherman's has long since faded or been painted over during restoration. The casual observer sees only generic Sherman tanks, identical in appearance, unaware that some carried revolutionary protection, while others relied on obsolete armor that German guns could penetrate reliably. But for the families of the 9,000 American tank crew members who survived the war because of gradient armor, the distinction remains profoundly significant. Their fathers and grandfathers came home because a Viennese metallurgist understood how to make steel resist penetration by creating carefully engineered hardness gradients invisible to the enemy. The survival of those crews represented not just individual lives saved, but entire lineages preserved, generations born because Hirsch's armor stopped German shells at 800 yards. The German perspective on American armor remained confused even in post-war analysis. Former Wehrmacht officers interviewed by American military historians in the 1950s continued attributing improved Sherman survivability to factors ranging from better crew training to changes in American tactical doctrine. Few recognized that they had been fighting against an enemy whose armor had fundamentally changed without their knowledge. The intelligence failure that allowed gradient armor to remain undetected throughout the war became a case study in how technological advantages can decisively influence combat outcomes when the enemy fails to adapt. In the final accounting, gradient armor represented the kind of innovation that shaped wars without dominating headlines. It was not a wonder weapon or revolutionary new technology. It was simply better steel, cooled more carefully, protecting crews more effectively than the armor it replaced. The unglamorous nature of the innovation made it easy to overlook, but the 9,000 lives it saved testified to the profound impact that material science could have on military outcomes. The lesson Hirsch learned from gradient armor development stayed with him throughout his post-war career. Engineering was never just about equations and materials properties. It was about understanding that every technical decision had human consequences, that innovations saved or cost lives, and that the responsibility of scientific work extended far beyond laboratory testing into the muddy fields where young men fought and died. Those who survived because of better armor rarely knew the names of the engineers who designed it, but their survival was proof that innovation mattered, that science applied with wisdom and urgency could tilt the balance between life and death. Hirsch's final laboratory notebook, preserved in the archives of the University of Michigan, contains an entry dated May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The entry is brief, just 3 lines written in Hirsch's precise technical script. War in Europe concluded. Gradient armor program successful beyond initial projections. Perhaps metal can be taught to protect as well as destroy. That understated assessment captured the essence of what gradient armor represented. It was metal taught to protect, steel engineered to save rather than kill, armor that stopped German shells at 800 yards and gave American tank crews a chance to come home alive. The quiet revolution in metallurgy had succeeded, invisible to the enemy, decisive in its impact, and ultimately proof that human ingenuity applied to the problems of survival could alter the course of history, one armor plate at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.